Good morning, friends. Welcome to this SUG Columbus December session. Happy holidays. Today we have Jeff as our speaker for Sitecore JSS front-end development workflow with Storybook. If you are not aware, Storybook is, I think, React, what you can say, style guide implementation. Jeff is very famous name in Sitecore community. Most of you have heard. If you are on a Slack, definitely you must have heard. He is currently working as Director of Technology at Fishtank Consulting. He was part of Sitecore for more than 4 years, and recently he has switched to partner side to help out community. He is sharing today. Jeff, floor is yours.
Thank you, Malik. Let me share my screen and collapse that window. All right. You should see my title slide now. Perfect. So thank you. As Malik said, I am Jeff Lheureux. My real name is Jean-François, but Jeff is fine for me. It's easier for English-speaking people as well. For 2 months about, I'm now Director of Technology at Fishtank Consulting. And prior to that, I was working 4 years at Sitecore, building demos for the Sitecore community partners and for the internal people at Sitecore as well. Before that, even, I was 3 years Sitecore MVP, and I hope I will be Sitecore MVP again next year. I work hard for that by doing this kind of talks, helping the community as much as I can, and developing some modules as well. So today's agenda, is there a question? Okay. Today's agenda, we will talk about JSS, we will talk about Storybook, of course, but we will start with a brief history of Sitecore JSS and what's the modes you can develop with Sitecore JSS. There's code first and Sitecore first. We'll see the difference between those. We'll talk about Storybook, the structure of stories file, how it can help with Sitecore JSS projects. And I will share tips and tricks on how to use Storybook with Sitecore JSS as I learned with my years of experience with it. So the two modes we can use when developing JSS applications are code first and Sitecore first. Code first was introduced early on. The first version of JSS had code first and Sitecore first as well. But code first is less and less used in the real world nowadays. And it's understandable because it has a lot of cons. So with code first, the general idea is that you don't need the Sitecore instance to be able to develop your front-end application. You can do that with page definitions and content that is defined in local YAML or JSON files directly in your front-end project. So it's like mock pages and mock content for your front-end project. And you had to run your front-end app in a special mode called disconnected mode with a special npm run command. And then your front-end project was really reading those YAML and JSON files to display your pages and your components. It had a couple of limitations, though. First, it did not support complex field types. So if you had multi-list or even more complex than that, or custom field types that you wanted to develop, it was not possible to do that. Also, this mode was like a trampoline to the Sitecore first mode, and there was a JSS CLI command to import what you had defined in YAML or JSON files into Sitecore as items. But once this was done first, and you wanted to move pages or move content in your YAML files and you did run that import command again, then it was unable to rename and remove the Sitecore items in the Sitecore content tree. So it was hard to work with that. And it was also hard to reuse a given data source item across multiple pages in YAML. And in the import flow, then your data source was imported multiple times and there were duplicates in the Sitecore items that you had to clean up afterwards. And it was quite time consuming. On the other side, the Sitecore first mode requires a Sitecore instance. It's mandatory. So you have either to run it locally using IIS, using Docker, or remotely, you host a Sitecore instance for your developers, called a dev instance, and all developers connect to it, for example. That's possibilities. Another thing is that the page definition and the content is Sitecore items as we know them. Classic Sitecore items, templates, renderings, etc. You run your front-end app in connected mode this time using a different npm run command that connects to Sitecore to fetch the data. It has some pros and some cons as well. So the first pro is that you have the full power of Sitecore when you develop using that mode. There's no limitation on the field types, on the sharing data sources, content, location. You build your content tree as you wish, and your front-end application just reads it. You don't have to import and things like that. However, the con is that it's a bit slower development. So instead of just writing some stuff in a YAML file and then you have both the rendering, the content and everything, you have to create your template, create your fields, decide if they are shared or not, and then create a data source item, create your rendering item for your components, and then create the pages, build the pages in Experience Editor or XM Cloud pages if you're on XM Cloud. So your front end now has to know a little bit how to navigate inside Sitecore to create those items, assemble the pages. Either you have front-end developers that know how to do that, or you separate the task, front-end developers doing only React HTML, CSS, and another Sitecore developer that creates the templates, create the stuff, serialize everything. So with that being said, things evolve in the JSS world over the years. So JSS started years ago, and in general, all the new JSS projects are always created in code first mode with a sample style guide as the content. It comes with the YAML files to display that sample style guide, which shows all of the components you can reuse in Sitecore. In JSS 19, the Sitecore dev team decided to add a parameter to the JSS CLI to be able to create Next.js projects without the style guide. It was -- empty. So that was the first step toward what we know today, where the style guide is really optional and it doesn't come with the projects anymore by default. But that was just for the Next.js project though. React, Angular, Vue projects, all of these always get the style guide still to this day. In JSS 20, the template for the Next.js application was split into a main template and a couple of optional add-on templates, including the SXA template, the style guide template, the multi-site template, and the CDP Personalize template, if I'm correct. So there's a few of them. So the base template doesn't come with the style guide, and the style guide add-on template adds the style guide to your project. Yeah, Next.js style guide is this one. And as I mentioned earlier, React, Angular, Vue templates still have that style guide by default and comes in code first mode with that YAML content for defining the page and the content. So for this presentation with Storybook and JSS, I created a new application a couple of weeks ago, and I used the template Next.js and Next.js SXA. So I have all the base Next.js template, and I have this optional one, which adds a couple of renderings that are there in headless SXA by default, and it adds a couple of middlewares for redirects, robots detection, and things like that. Not robots detection, but robot.txt file. So the command to create it nowadays is npx create Sitecore JSS, and you pass in the template. There's other arguments as well you can pass, but I don't cover them here. And when you create that project, by default, it doesn't have the temp file for your config, your component factory, and things like that. And those are created by the bootstrap script in the package.json file. So I've run npm run bootstrap first and foremost to avoid later problem in Storybook because Storybook reads your app config and runs your application. Storybook now, what it is. Storybook is open source first, and it's an app to create an isolated environment to test and display your front-end components, basically, your user interface components. So it's very useful for developing components, documenting them, and testing them. Here on the right side, we see what Storybook looks like when it opens in your browser. Here I'm on the content block component. So on the left side here, we can have folders that we as developers decide what their name are. And we can have then stories files. Each of those blue icons is a different stories file in my application. And under each of those blue package icon, we have variants. So we have documentation in orange and variants in teal blue, something like that. Default, empty field value, no fields are my variants for my content block component stories. On the right side, we have the component that is displayed. Here at the top, there's a couple of controls to manage the size, to test different size and zooming, stuff like that. And on the bottom, there's the action panel that shows what are the parameters for this component, what actions it can do, and what interactions it can do as well. I've not myself studied much about the actions, interactions, and controls here. What I care about first is defining the stories, defining variants, and building components to see how they work in isolation. Then Storybook works with stories files. Those are files that ends with .stories.tsx. And here's the structure of one. We can see at the top, there's the import, export, base stuff. That's the component setup and options. So on line 6, we have the title, which defines where it shows in that left tree in Storybook. So it will show in the components folder, and its name will be content block, the blue icon with like a package icon. Then we define which component it is, some parameters if we want it centered left. There's a couple of parameters supported by Storybook. We can have tags if we want auto documentation of this component and its parameters. That creates the docs yellow icon on the left side. And we export a story a story object of the type of our component, basically. So this is pretty much the same for all of the stories, for all of the components. Then at the bottom, we can create one or more stories based on that type on line 15. So the name you set for your cons that is exported is the name that will display in the left navigation in Storybook as the variants. So if you define just one story, there's one variant. If you define more than one exported cons, there would be more than one variant for that same component. So here, here I will explain the args a little bit later, but basically those are the args you pass to your component being tested or being developed. And you have to pass args that match the JSS args that are usually passed to your container. So you have a rendering object, params object, and your fields for that component. And some of them are necessary for the components to display correctly. Now, let's talk about how Storybook can help you with Sitecore JSS. So in the code first mode, you were able to create your mock data for your components, for your website very easily in YAML files. But with Sitecore first mode, then you don't have this possibility anymore to test your component, what they display, if the text is long, if the text is short, if the image is bigger, if it's smaller than the div it shows in, stuff like that. So Storybook can help with Sitecore JSS and Sitecore first mode first to develop and test your JSS components without having to run Sitecore on the side and create all your templates and your renderings and your data source and your pages. You can skip all of that as a front-end developer and just run Storybook, create the stories for your component, just pass it mock data in the stories that is exported, and bam, you have your component working in isolation. You can test what happens if in all of those edge cases. Yeah, you can. That's my second point. You can define the mock data source values to test edge cases and generic ones. That really shortens the front-end development feedback loop. So instead of creating all those items in Sitecore just to see your component in action, the moment you create your component and your story, you see it, and then you can go and iteratively add new fields, new content to your component and test it in mobile, in desktop view, small, big, different text, different values. It allows front-end devs to also use non-Windows computers, because to run Sitecore on IIS, you need Windows. On Docker, you also need Windows, because Windows containers don't run on Mac computers or Linux computers nowadays. And that Storybook helps to develop JSS on Macs or Linux machines. To add Storybook to your project, it's quite simple. You run npx Storybook. Usually you want the latest version with init as a parameter. And Storybook automatically detects the type of project you have. Here it's a Next.js project. It installs all the right add-ons, plugins, initialize, create files in your file structure, add scripts to your package.json file to start Storybook. And also it adds sample components and sample stories for you to see how a stories file is made, etc. So what I like to do when I integrate Storybook into a new JSS project I'm working on, first thing I do after initializing is remove the sample components and sample stories that comes with the Storybook install. So that's the line in green to remove the stories. And then you can run Storybook, npm run Storybook. It's a new script added to your package.json file, and it opens the Storybook UI as the screenshot I showed earlier. But you will have no components and no stories on the left side navigation, of course, because there's none anymore. So the first task we have to do as a JSS front-end developer is to create stories file for our components. But let's say I want to create a story file every time I create a new component. And we're lucky because Sitecore JSS has a script called scaffold. When you call it, it creates a sample component for you in your file structure. And you can modify this script to also do other things like creating a stories file. That's super useful because front-end developers, when they have both the new component and the stories, they can start faster to see their component in action. So the command is npm run scaffold. You define a new component name and optionally a new component path if you don't want it directly in the components folder. And to that, this script now with JSS 20 or 21, it's based on a plugin system. So you can create new plugins to add to the default behavior of that script. So that's the base stories file that is used when you do npm run scaffold. Basically, it outputs oh no, that's my stories file, sorry. So let me show you first here in VS Code. I'll zoom a little bit. Zooming. Okay. So in the scripts folder of your project, you usually have templates and scaffold component plugins here, as well as a script here that is, no, it's not here. Anyways, scaffold component is here, and by default, there's just components. And what that does, it creates a component that has this code here. And it replaces the variables. So you say, I want the component name ABC. You will have an interface named ABC props. You will have a const default that has ABC props here, and it will show ABC component in the middle. So that's the default behavior of that script. Now I added an extra file for my templates. It's called stories source instead of component source. And here I define what I want as my default stories for my new components. And they use the same component name, so it knows where the component is inside of the file structure, reference it correctly, and it creates the title, component, and everything. One important thing is I also put the regular JSS component props, so rendering and params. So you don't have surprises if you use those props in your component or you use a couple of React hooks that make use of them in your component, it will still display. So I got to this point after creating stories for multiple components over the past. Oops. And I discovered that we need a component name. We need a data source with something that is truthy. We need params and rendering identifier, and params here for the scaffolded components. By default, they use that. And that data source is really important because if you have any component that use the with data source check high order component in React and JSS, this high order component checks if the value of the data source property is truthy. So it cannot be an empty string, it cannot be null or undefined. It needs to be some string with a value. So I just output a dummy string here for my stories for all of my components using that high order component. to render correctly on their Storybook. And then I wrote a plugin, storybook.ts, in the plugins folder of scaffold component. And I import my new template that I just created. I set the order to 99 because the existing component plugin use also order 99. So I want the same order as this one. And it doesn't matter if mine or the original one run first or second. They are both independent and don't depend on each other. And then I won't explain all the code, but basically at the end, I scaffold the new file based on the template with the new parameters. And I'll return the existing config for the plugin system, plus my new stories output path, which is the path where the story file was created on the file system. And I have another plugin, Next Steps Storybook. This one has order 102 because the next step by default has 100, and next step bring your own code as order 101. So I wanted Storybook explanations to go after these two out of the box ones. So I decided to have 102. And what it does, it just outputs in the console, hey, you have a new story file that was created. You can test your component in that by running JSS Storybook and add your mock data in the story output path in the file that was just created. So I already talked about the order. After doing that, it's cool because we have a new stories file for every new component. But I would also want to have stories file for all my existing components if I add Storybook in my project later in the pipeline. So that's also possible. I created a script, generate stories.ts. I won't explain it, but it does pretty much the same thing. It just traverses the components folder, find all the components that don't have a stories file, and create the stories files for you. So with a default story that tests the component without any special props. And then you can go in each of them and add the props. I'll add your mock data for each of the stories. And what it does, it creates in the stories folder, it creates the same structure as in your components folder. So it will create components and do all the components that we had. Since I created my application with the SXA add-on, then I have all the default headless SXA components here, which are there. But when I run Storybook using these default stories, there's a lot of errors because my components are maybe doing something special, maybe they're missing props, so they don't render correctly, etc. So I have to go in the stories that fail to fix them. But how to find which one are failing and which one are okay? Manually, you have to go into each of those stories on the left side, click on them, it opens the default variant, and you see on the right side if there's an error or not. So that may be time consuming if you have a lot of components already in your solution. So here comes the next tips and trick. Storybook comes with a test runner. So it's easy to use and it allows you to identify which stories are failing easily. That can be run, as I said, to identify when you start integrating Storybook, identify which stories are failing, but could also be useful in your CI pipeline to identify if you have stories that are failing after some code change in a pull request. That's super useful. To install that plugin, it's npm install Storybook test runner, and it's a development dependency. And then you also have to install Playwright in your code. So npx playwright install. And then you can npm run test Storybook, which is a new script added by this Storybook test runner. And it will output after a couple of other lines in your console. At the end, it outputs all the tests that passes and all the tests that fails and a summary at the end. So that allows you to quickly determine which one need a little bit of love. My next tip is now, after you start fixing those stories, you will find that some of these are failing because they use the Sitecore context. And it's nothing wrong per se, but Storybook is not equipped by default to handle the use of the Sitecore context. So I have a tip for you to fix that. When you install Storybook, let me show you something here. At the root of your front-end project, it creates a Storybook folder, and there's main, preview head, and preview files. By default, those are JavaScript files, preview.js, and it contains what we want to run in that Storybook preview UI. So basically the Storybook UI you see in the browser. And by default, this is what it looks like. Oh, for a TypeScript project, it's .ts, but for a JavaScript project, it would be .js. It has this. It's just default stuff to define some colors, dates, and define the preview UI, basically. But we can add to it. The first thing we want to add to support the Sitecore context is a decorator. So here we had parameters from line 4 to 12, and I didn't touch them. Those are now from line 19 to 21. I just put a comment to add some briefly to the screenshot, but I didn't touch the parameters. I added a decorators parameter. And for each story, I want to wrap the story with a SitecoreContext React context.provider, which I import from the JSS Next.js library. And I pass a value, which is what I want to mock as a Sitecore context here. So on line 5, I create a mock layout data that has a Sitecore object, a context, a set context function that does nothing, and a null root that it's not necessary to have something here. And I say, oh, my context, I want page editing false. So in Storybook, I see the components as they would be displayed on the final website, not as in editing mode in Experience Editor or Pages. And I want the page state to be normal as well. And yeah, and here I wrap with the React context. So I don't have what it looks like after, but the components that use the Sitecore context, page editing or page state now start working in Storybook. The next tip is how to create some stories for the editing experience. Let's say you have a component that you want to display a different user experience when it's in edit mode, then you want it to be displayed in the final website. So you have some code that uses the Sitecore context and checks if the page mode is edit or preview, render this instead, and if it's not that, then render the default stuff. So you can write stories for that as well. You would write a new story, so you would export an extra constant in your stories file, and you would name it whatever you want. And the name you put to your stories here is the name displayed on the left sidebar of Storybook. But Storybook is intelligent enough to detect the uppercase letters in that const name, and it beautifuls the name. So it will be no space data source space in edit mode, all with spaces. So a nice human readable name from that constant. So what I'm doing in here specifically, I'm setting the data source as an empty string to test that when I have no data source in edit mode. That's the goal of my story. So by default, remember I put a data source that was a dummy string for all of my stories that were generated. But now here, for this specific story, I override and I say, hey, this one has no data source. And I create a different mock layout data for my SitecoreContext, especially for this story. And in here, I use all the same information from the exported mock layout data in the previous file that I import from my .storybook preview file. And then I replace the context and I say, hey, for this story, the context will be page editing true and page state edit. And so I also add a decorator here because I need to provide a different mock layout data for my SitecoreContext React context provider. I don't have a screenshot, but this would be okay to have a specific variant of your stories for this component for the editing experience with no data source. Basically, it will display you need a data source for this component. That's the with data source check iOrder component work here. Next tip is how to add components to placeholders. You will also have components that define some placeholders, and you would like to test, hey, what happens if I put one component in my placeholder? What happens if I put 3 components in the placeholder? If you have more than one placeholder on your component, what happens if I put components inside just one of the 3 placeholders? Things like that. That also can be done, but it needs an extra configuration because by default, you don't have a component factory for Storybook. It doesn't know how to use it. And it will just say, hey, there's no implementation for the component you try to put inside of the placeholders. So for example, here's the column splitter SXA component and the stories for it. And what I've done in its default story, I defined the params and say, oh, for this story, for my column splitter, I want 2 placeholders. So I said enabled placeholders is placeholder 1 and placeholder 2. How I came with why did I need this specific param? I just checked the component code and check how it was working. And then I guessed that it was what I needed. And then for my placeholder 1 and placeholder 2, I created the placeholder definition for this rendering. So inside of my column placeholder 1, I want a placeholder child component, and same thing inside my placeholder number 2, I add the same child component. And my child component is defined just as JSON data. It needs a UID, can be anything. It needs the rendering object. It would be the same as any other rendering object. So I took the one from the content block default story file, and I reuse its args.rendering. And for the fields, same thing. I use the default content block story fields for the arg. So maybe if I can show it here, stories, content block, my default story has some args, which are the common args, and some fields, which is just heading and content. My common args, I define them here because I reuse them in multiple variants. So I have content block as the component name, anything as the data source, and a random identifier and some params and styles as well. So that's what I'm reusing in my column splitter, right? Column splitter here. I reuse those from that other component. And oh yeah, so that's the explanation I just gave. My content block stories already has rendering in fields, which is what I'm reusing here. But when I save that, there's another roadblock ahead. My browser console says there's no component factory to service my request for my component. It's a little bit obfuscated here, but for my component content block, basically. And it says it contains an unknown component called content block. It doesn't know how to render that. So usually that means in the JSS world, you define a component, but it's not yet in your component factory or something like that. But here, since the context is different, we are running in Storybook. We have to tell Storybook where to look for the component factory. So remember that preview.ts file to where I added the SitecoreContext React context provider. We can modify that a little bit. And instead of having a SitecoreContext React context, we will switch that to just a Sitecore context. But this Sitecore context requires two attributes. First, a component factory, and second, layout data. Previously, we only had the mock layout data. So the layout data would be the same thing, but instead of mock layout data.sitecore, it's just mock layout data. And for my component factory, I'm reusing what's existing in my JSS application already. So we already have a component builder file in the temp folder, and I'm reusing it. So I get the component factory, and I tell it isEditing is the same as the editing property of my mock layout data. If I show to you what it looks like, preview. So maybe it would be best like this. Page editing here is coming from mock layout data, which is here. It's the same value. So if I change this to true, then automatically my component factory will get the component factory for page editing true as well. So it's all connected. And with that, then it allows the placeholder to find the components to render in the placeholders. Another tip here is how to use existing styles. So for now, since I started, here's another screenshot. Everything was shown in like Times New Roman font, and it's not the font I'm using on my website. So we have to tell Storybook to go a little bit beyond the component level that are isolated and also bring some of the stuff for the application level, like the styles that we use, the fonts that we use, and things like that. So again, in the preview.tsx file, we can add an import of our styles. And now the preview application for Storybook will now have access to these styles and will render our stuff correctly. However, the Next.js SXA add-on for JSS does some funky stuff with the styles. A lot of place in the Sass files, it has some imports with @sass abstracts, spark colors, or other files, but they all start with @sass or @font awesome, things like that. And these are not real NPM package that were installed. It's just an alias to a folder inside of the file structure. So it's really weird, and I didn't find a good way to make Storybook aware of those aliases to different folders. So I ended up just replacing @sass with the proper folder names where to find that colors file, for example. So that's the explanation here. Those are the imports inside of the SAS files from the plugin. And here are the files directly in your file system in the SAS folder. It's just, this is the aliases defined by the JSS team for that starter kit project. So add SAS is ... assets, and font awesome goes to somewhere in the font awesome node module. So I just decided to replace add SAS by the correct path. Same thing for font awesome. So before on the left, we had the default styles for Storybook, and on the right side, the new styles defined by this application. So in my case, I had a little bit more roadblocks and work to do to make it work. But if you don't use the default styles from Next.js SXA and you define your own Tailwind styles or your own SAS files, you should not run into that issue yourself, other than if you define by yourself some aliases like this. Another of my tip is how to use custom fonts. So right now it's using another font, but let's say I want to use a completely different font than that, and it's not imported directly in my CSS files. There's a way to do that. For example, the default container.sas file from the SXA package defines the font family as Roboto. Let's say I want Sarah instead. And Sarah, to load it into Storybook, what I have to do is go in the preview-head.html file in the .storybook folder. And anything I put here will end up in the head of the Storybook application. So I can add scripts, links, title if I want, meta tags, anything that can go in a head element. So here I define a link to my style sheet to load the Sarah file from Google Fonts. And what I end up with is a different font in Storybook as well as in my application. And that was the last of my tips. I hope you enjoyed and learned from those tips. All the code I showed today in the screenshot and in Visual Studio Code is available in one of my GitHub projects. You can take a screenshot of that. The QR code will lead you to there. Otherwise, it's pinned, I think, in my GitHub profile. So it's easy to find out. I previously had a very old version of the Storybook JSS integration that was dating like JSS 16 or a very old version. So I decided to update it recently for this user group presentation. And if you follow me on my blog, jflh.ca, I will write probably a couple of articles about Storybook and those tips in the future, or maybe it will be on the Fishtank blog as well. I'm not sure about that yet. With that being said, thank you for attending this session, and I will open the chat right now to see what are the questions.
Thank you, Jeff. We do have some questions from Katie. Katie, you want to go?
Sure. Do you recommend that there should be a single .stories TSX file for each component and that the variant should be exported from that file? Or should it be set up where every variant has its own, or does it matter?
It does matter, yes, because let me go back to one of the screenshots here. If you define more than one stories file per component, you will end up with more than one blue node here. So content block would have more than one node inside of the components folder. While if you define one file with multiple exported const as the variants, it will have this structure with one top level component and multiple variants inside of it in the tree.
Perfect. Yeah, we just finished an implementation using Storybook and everything is weird, and that is why. And we're going to fix it. What's your opinion about the order that front-end work should be developed? Should the front-end team follow the Sitecore devs and use predefined interface data? Or can the front-end team work independent? And I feel like Sitecore first is the answer here, but I just wanted to see what you thought.
Yeah, good question. Depends on the skills of your front-end developers, if they're able to create their templates themselves in the Sitecore content tree or not. Otherwise, a good set of predefined field names would be important. Like in the project I've worked, we decided that all pages would have a title field, and components that needs a heading, it will always be heading for the file, the field name. And we defined as well that all the fields starts with a lowercase character. So with that in mind, the front-end developers were able to create their types as the Sitecore developers would create the templates and the fields later on. So there was a contract between front-end and back-end or Sitecore developers in here that was respected.
Okay, yeah, and we managed to run into that hiccup as well. So we got to do a bunch of extra work because we've launched one project, and it was very early in the process and in the XM Cloud release. So I'm glad to hear that there's actually a better way to do it. I'm sure I have 1,000 more questions, but I don't want to hog your time. So I'll stand down.
No problem.
Yield the floor.
You can ping me on the Sitecore community Slack or
I was already planning on it.
Headless channel as well.
Yeah, I'll find you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you, Katie. I don't see any other question on the chat, but if anyone has any question, this is the time to ask.
Yeah, I see one about Bootstrap or Tailwind. Yeah, as I mentioned somewhere in the presentation, I use Bootstrap here because it's the default that comes with the Next.js-SXA add-on template for JSS. It comes with default styles, and I wanted an example with those default styles. But yeah, you can use whatever CSS technology you want for your components. Even if you work with headless SXA, you can switch to Tailwind or something else. And the same thing goes to integrate that into Storybook. In the past, I've integrated Tailwind into Storybook. It was a bit more work. I think in the other repository, there's the solution for that. And maybe I can go here. I wanted to show you the repository itself. So /Jeff. If you go to my JSS repository, I've organized the commits as well as logical steps. So by default, it's just the npx create, and then it's installing Storybook. So you can have the diff of all the steps I did, a diff to delete the default Storybook stories, then the diff to scaffold one Storybook story for each component, and so on. So sometimes a later commit change a file that was edited earlier, like I mentioned in my tips and tricks, like switching from the React context something to a SitecoreContext. That was another commit. And my previous version of that repository is somewhere here, JSS Next.js Storybook without the version in the name. And this one is also organized the same way and it also shows a bit of chromatic, which is another thing Storybook does. But this one shows how to add Tailwind, I think, to Storybook.
Awesome. Okay, Katie, you have another question?
Sorry, you said chromatic, which is my other favorite word.
Mhm.
And I can probably bother you about this in the Slack channel just to save time here, but have you used the automated tools to create the workflow to work with design team folks, or I'm
I
having
use
trouble getting my head around it.
Yeah, I use Chromatic with the free tier, where you have a
Mhm.
defined number of builds per month.
Mhm.
And because we were doing more pull requests and commits than this default, we didn't activate the automatic pull request validations if Chromatic was reporting errors. But in my experience, it works quite well. Yeah, you can define Chromatic. It will build all of your stories and take screenshots of them, and will compare the screenshots between the latest good version and this PR version. And if there's a slight, maybe be a move of the component from a couple of pixels, a change of colors, and anything that makes the component not render the same way as before, it will flag that as a potential problem, and it will block the pull request from being completed until you resolve those Chromatic issues. So you go into the Chromatic link and it shows your storybook basically and all the changes. And you can say, oh, for this component, for this variant, it's expected that it has changed because my change for that PR is specifically to fix that issue, for example. But sometimes you also catch effects that you didn't think about. You change something in a CSS file and you think it applies only to one component, and it end up modifying a lot of components and would have broke them if not catched by this screenshot test.
That's awesome. I just put a link to my favorite 3-minute video about Chromatic in case
Nice.
anybody's curious. It's
Yeah,
a 3-minute demo and it shows the whole process. It's amazing.
cool.
Thank you, Katie.
The previous version of this presentation was including Chromatic, but after I revisited it, there was not enough time at the end to cover Chromatic. So maybe I'll create a separate presentation for Chromatic in the future.
Thank you. All right, we are almost out of time. Thank you very much, Jeff. It was awesome presentation. We are we're happy to end the year with such a good presentation. And thank you everyone for joining today. Happy holidays. Happy New Year.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. This is
Bye.
recorded and it will be posted in our YouTube channel and we'll share with the group. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.